Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm for this edition of This City Live. I'm joined today by Paul Taylor, the Executive Director of FoodShare. It's an umbrella organization that fights on many fronts to eliminate food insecurity. It supports grassroots initiatives, advocates for systemic change, and through a variety of channels, gets fruit and vegetables into the hands of people who need it. Food, Paul has said, is a fundamental human right. That is the foundation upon which his work is based. I myself am a subscriber to FoodShare's excellent weekly food box, and I can attest that it's excellent. When I signed up for it, I had no idea I was participating in a social enterprise. I just did it because it seemed like a great product. And I've been learning a lot more about what FoodShare has been doing, and it's very interesting, and I look forward to talking to Paul about it tonight. Recently, FoodShare worked with the University of Toronto on important research about the relationship between racism and food insecurity, which I hope we can discuss this evening. Paul, welcome. Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much.
This afternoon, on Toronto Life's website, we published a story about your life. I hope everyone gets a chance to read it, in which you described your childhood. And I was hoping we could start there, because from what I understand, your own personal experience has informed your life's work. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what your own childhood was like growing up at Bloor and Lansdowne in Toronto. From what I understand, your mom worked for a while at 3 different jobs, at 3 different nursing homes. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about your childhood experiences.
Absolutely. So like you said, I grew up at Bloor and Lansdowne. And at the time that I grew up in the neighborhood, it was in an undesirable place to live. But for us, it was home. We loved it. It's where my mother got all of the foods that she was accustomed to, that she had eaten in the Caribbean. So it was between Bloor and Lansdowne and a few steps down the road to Parkdale, where we would get things like our green bananas, the okra, mangoes, saltfish. Some of those things I haven't developed a love for, but and like you said, my mother, one of the hardest working humans I know, for much of my childhood spent lots of hours working and away from the home, and worked so much, 3 different jobs, that she eventually became ill and had to stop working. When she did that, we had to rely on welfare, social assistance, which would have been really shocking for my mother. I was a little boy, and my older brother also experiencing this, and it was, I'll never forget this moment in 1995 when Mike Harris's government was elected and they decided to cut welfare by 22%. It was the first time I saw my mother cry, because it meant the amount of money that she had to take care of us was going to be significantly reduced. It was shortly after that things like our heat was cut, electricity cut, and we were without hot water. So, a lot of those experiences, and I think the shame that goes with growing up materially poor, have really informed a lot of my work since then.
And soon after university, from what I understand, you started working in Scarborough at a homeless youth shelter. What was and then for about 10 years, from what I understand, you worked in the community. What did you learn during that period of your life?
Yeah, so I would say actually, even before that, I was a teacher and taught at private schools, oddly enough. But, thought I was going to have an opportunity to shape young people that had access to the resources to really advance change. And ultimately, I decided that wasn't the work that I was interested in continuing. So I applied for a job at a homeless youth shelter. And to be quite frank, I remember the day I walked through those doors. Here I am thinking that I'm going to do good work with folks much more like myself when I was a child. And I was invited into a kind of 2-tiered system in terms of what we think people that are materially poor are entitled to. So not only did I live that experience, but then working in a space where, the people who run these organizations are saying, of course, in our homes, our kids have milk and fresh fruit. But when you look at what's available at the shelter, it wasn't the same. So I think I came with this idea of, building something better and pushing beyond the constructs that had been defined for us around what a homeless shelter should be. So we did amazing things with food and started a from scratch kitchen, open an art studio, hired programmers that were able then to help the youth with physical and recreational programming. And it was so the 10 years kind of after that, or including that, I also, after that time working at the shelter, pushing up against that narrative, I moved to Vancouver. I'd never been to British Columbia before, and I got this job working in the downtown east side of Vancouver. So a community that's often referred to as, I've often heard it referred to as Canada's poorest postal code. But my experience was that I learned so much from my time there, just a wealth of experience that also really shaped the way I think about the work that I do. So it was, what was so important to that work, it was organizing for better alongside low-income folks. Alongside low-income folks, people experiencing homelessness, survival sex workers, we had all kinds of hijinks that we got involved in, trying to push governments to recognize that charity, which had been defined as our kind of response to poverty and food insecurity, wasn't ultimately as helpful as other levers were. So,
right. So you have spoken about how food banks are not necessarily the answer. They do. Can you sort of talk a little bit about what it works with our food bank system and what you think some of the problems are?
Okay, so I think what works with our food banking, so two things I would say that I think are positive. One, communities are responding to a moral imperative to feed people that are hungry. So I think it's great to see that kind of energy go into caring for one another. I think that's really important. I'm also enthused by some of the advocacy that I see food banks in this country, some, not all, but some food banks in this country really pushing the conversation around the types of interventions that we know are more helpful. But in terms of some of the problems with charity, I think they're numerous, Food banks in particular, of the number of people that are food insecure in Canada, only a quarter of those folks actually access a food bank for a whole host of reasons: shame, access, and also food banks. We've seen reports. I think the Daily Bread Food Bank here in Toronto produced a report that said, 21% of food banks report having run out of food. The other piece, is I think especially historically, a lot of the types of food that's been made available at food banks, actually I sometimes call them food-like substances, where we're tricking the people who come to them who are hungry into believing that they are getting nutrients in some food, but ultimately these are foods that are lacking in nutrients. We also, when people go and access a food bank or charity, food charity, often we're demanding gratitude, and they have to fit into our notions of what their need looks like. My friend Teresa once told me that she was at a food bank and she wanted to swap the Kraft dinner for a bar of soap. And the person handing out the food said, well, you mustn't be that hungry. So I think it's really important also for us to recognize the shame, but also that we're not going to end poverty or food insecurity with, leftover sheet cake from the office party. We're not going to end it with canned food donations, community kitchens, or even the two-legged carrots that we're hearing so much about. It's really an issue largely of income. So that's where we're going to see the most bang for our buck. And I think charities actually prevent people sometimes from asking, why is it so many people are in need? And inhibit us from really looking at systemically and saying, well, wait a minute. We've got 4 million Canadians that are food insecure, but we also have 45 billionaires in this country that aren't paying their fair share. So what we want from them is for them to pay their fair share through taxes and not donations.
We're entering in our during COVID into some massive social experimentation with universal basic income. And I'm wondering, not explicitly, but there's people many government checks are going out into the community. Do you think there's an opportunity here for us to learn about what happens when money is placed in the hands of people who need it?
Oh, I would say we know that already. For a long time, folks in kind of the so-called food movement have advocated for basic income, and part of the reason many people have done that is because in this country, we actually have a basic income for seniors, and we see the impact thanks to some research out of U of T and the team at Proof, we see the impact that once someone becomes a senior and they're able to access things like old age security, the guaranteed income supplement, and their CPP, aggregately, when we look at the population, the entire population, we see people's significant decrease in food insecurity once they hit that age. That's true of the entire population, but not so true of the Black population. So I know that's one of the things we're going to get into a little bit later, and I'm happy to.
Yes, well, I can ask you about that now. I'd like to hear about that research that you've been doing. First of all, why did you commission it in the first place, and what did it involve?
So we commissioned it, so a couple of things. So I guess we commissioned it when I'm working at FoodShare. One of the first things I did is I went on tours to look at many of our programs, some of the markets that we help develop in communities. And one of the things that struck me is that most of the people that I was seeing accessing our services were Black and brown folks, Indigenous folks of color. And I thought, well, wait a minute, Toronto is an incredibly diverse city, but it felt like the darker your skin is, the more likely you are going to have to access or rely on community-based food programs. So we wanted to better understand what was happening. So we connected up with folks like Valerie Tarasic at the U of T Proof to kind of interrogate this question a little bit further. And it had never been done actually to this extent. So when I say, I'm going to jump around a little bit. But it had never been done, so it really shifted the narrative. When I talk about seniors and I say that seniors decrease their risk to food insecurity, one of the things we found was that isn't the case for Black folks. So it had never been done. So we never looked at a specific vulnerable population. Instead, we've been talking about these what happens across the country. So. About that research, so we found some key things. We found that if you're Black in Canada, you're 3.5 times more likely to be food insecure than if you're white. We also found, really illuminating, some of the things that we typically understand that act as protections against food insecurity, so home ownership. Again, this is what we understood, but when we look specifically at Black folks and contrast that to white folks, we learned something very different. So, for example, 7.5% of white homeowners and 14.3% of white renters experience food insecurity. When you look at Black homeowners, that's 14.5% of Black homeowners experience food insecurity and 20.7% of Black renters. So what that means is, Black folks who own homes experience the same level of food insecurity as white renters do. We looked at things like household composition. So we learned that in single-parent households, we understood to really influence rates of food insecurity for white respondents. For Black respondents, that's not the case. It doesn't matter how many parents are in the home. Black folks maintain significantly higher probability of food insecurity. Even immigration status. It doesn't matter if Black respondents were born in Canada or born abroad. The risk remains consistently high. There are two other things that jumped out to us. One was around social assistance. I continue to talk to folks about that. I think is really important and really demonstrates the systemic racism that's embedded, in particular the anti-Black racism that's embedded in our institutions. We looked at where people derive their income from. And most people who are food insecure derive their income from work, but a portion of them also derive their income from social assistance. Oddly enough, there was a discrepancy between the amount of money that white folks received and the amount of money that Black folks received, which is odd because you think this is an equation, these are calculations. Well, actually, social assistance, those calculations include disability income supports, which leads us to believe that white folks are either more likely to be approved for disability or when they are approved for more money than Black folks. So what we realized is one of the biggest indicators of someone's exposure to risk of food insecurity was simply being born Black.
I should clarify, and maybe we should clarify what you mean by food insecurity, and also what FoodShare's role is in addressing it, and how it differs from the approach of just 3 day supplies of canned goods handed out by people lined up in a queue?
For sure. I guess I would say the first thing is food insecurity is, we don't even recognize it as a public health crisis. There are 4.4 million people in this country that negotiate food insecurity. That's almost equal to the combined populations of Toronto and Mississauga. This is a huge problem in this country. And I think what I see really often is I'll see organizations say that they're running a food security program, or, we see people with titles that say food security coordinator. It is impossible for community organizations or a single person with the title of food security coordinator to be tasked with advancing food security. Food security is largely about income. So food insecurity, is largely caused by income. So it's those types of income-based interventions that are critical to advancing food security for folks. And before I maybe get into what FoodShare, how we approach this work and what we do, I think there's something really interesting that happened in this country that's often not talked about. In the 1980s, the Thatcher-Reagan Mulroney era, we actually went from income-based interventions to support people that were poor or food insecure, and shifted to food-based interventions. So 1981 is when we saw the first food bank open in this country. The interesting thing about that is there was no conversation in Parliament. There was no public discussion. These decisions, I believe, were likely made in boardrooms, so by white men. Really set the country on a path for the kind of increases in poverty that we see, increases in food insecurity that are racialized. In terms of FoodShare and our approach to the work, we do a number of things. So I mentioned that the first food bank opened in 1981. We opened in 1985. Because we took a look at first we were connecting people to emergency food resources, then maybe took a look at the types of food or food-like substances that were being made available, and said, you know what? Low-income people deserve access to fresh, nutrient-dense produce. So we've designed a suite of initiatives aimed at doing that, and our work is really anchored in the right to food. The right to food was introduced by the federal government in 1976 in this country, not introduced in the US, but in Canada, we ratified the right to food, which means every Canadian should be able to access the food that they need. So FoodShare operates based on that lens and recognizes that there are huge problems when we have 4 million people that are hungry. So we intervene in terms of developing community-based food interventions, working alongside community and community partners. So we work with communities to build affordable produce markets. We create meal programs in schools with a bunch of partners. We offer community garden and compost training, school farming projects. But I think one of the biggest things we do is we advocate for systems change. We consider ourselves a food justice organization, which means that we're committed to working to dismantle the systems of oppression that create those inequities. Colonialism, white supremacy, patriarchy, that has to be a part of our work, and looking at income. So there are a number of things that we do to make sure that we're really looking at ourselves as an organization and thinking about what can we be doing to advance those things. So for example, when the Premier of Ontario decided to roll back minimum wage, we said, are you kidding? Roll back the planned increase to minimum wage. We said, are you kidding me? How could you expect Ontarians to live on $14 an hour? So we said, we challenge you for the rest of your mandate. If you think that's possible, we challenge you to live on $14 an hour. Well, we got a firm response. But, I think for us, it's been really important to say that income is a key piece, and we're going to, if to do our work means challenging any threats to people's income. So we're also showing up for low-wage workers in the food system as best we can. And we do that in a variety of ways.
You mentioned school food programs, and I know you're an advocate of a nationalized school food program. We don't have one in Canada. Many countries do. I've been thinking a lot about what's happened across the city when our schools closed during COVID, and what that meant to people without resources at home, kids who didn't have Wi-Fi access, kids who relied on lunch programs. What have you seen going on in the city as a kind of ripple effect of school closing down for kids who needed what school was able to provide.
Yeah, for a lot of kids, we know about the impact on educational attainment when folks have access to a healthy meal to start their days. So certainly, being disconnected from that is having a significant impact on families, low-income families in particular. But I also, while I think, a national school food program has significant value in this country, it's not a replacement for income and dollars in families' pockets that allow them to purchase the food that they want to see. And actually, can I just, I'm the worst person to interview because I jump around and I want to come back.
That makes you the best person to interview.
I'm glad that was your answer. I want to come back to something I didn't mention when you asked about basic income, because there's been a lot of conversation about what are the policies that the food movement is going to get behind to really advance to challenge food insecurity. And basic income has certainly emerged as a big one. School food has emerged as another. And I think I've been reluctant to articulate kind of how I see some things joining up, because I've really been watching this conversation around basic income, and there's been something that's felt amiss to me. And to me, when we solely think about basic income, there's two problems for me with a sole focus on basic income. One, I actually think it's one of the ways the food movement reinforces white supremacy. Basic income is a great mechanism on a go-forward basis, but does nothing to address the generations of systemic oppression that Black and Indigenous and racialized folks have had to endure. So I think we can't have a conversation around basic income without also having a conversation around reparations to meaningfully compensate people for having to negotiate a failed system and the impact that it's had on their lives and their health outcomes. The other piece to that is, I think a basic income silo is also challenging for me, because I think we need to think about it more. Basic income could be set anywhere. I think we actually need to take a step back and say, we live in one of the richest countries in the world. Little Paul shouldn't have been hungry. Kids across the country shouldn't be hungry. Families and folks across this country shouldn't be hungry. I think we need to think about what quality of life do we want to have or expect in one of the richest countries in the world. And as part of that, perhaps the conversation, must be around an income floor or minimum income, but it also has to be around a guarantee of a basket of services that people can rely on, whether that's pharmacare, whether that's housing, childcare, publicly funded childcare. These are the types of things that we need to look at it from, I think, a framework of the type of society we want to live in, and then look at the various policy tools available to advance that outcome.
Well, this is a good moment in world history to be having those types of really big conversations. The anti-racism movement that has swept mostly in America, but across the world over the last few weeks, has provoked some really, really important discussions. I know that FoodShare has played a role in that. FoodShare has been providing boxes to protesters who went to the march and are self-isolating. How did that idea come to you, and what has that? It's only been a week or two, and how did that all unfold? And tell me all about that.
So I guess maybe I'll take a couple steps back before I get to that piece. But if I don't get there, please just make sure I do.
I promise.
Okay. So FoodShare operates as a social enterprise, a good food box that you and I get at our homes. In fact, my delivery day is today, so I'm hoping the doorbell doesn't interrupt us. But if not, you'll just see me give away. So we were delivering these food boxes while the pandemic struck. And we realized that we were reading reports that 40% of food banks are closing, not knowing how to support people with access to the stuff that they give out. So we said, well, wait a minute. We have these vehicles traversing the city, dropping off food for people. We're going to raise some money to be able to allow us to deliver free good food boxes to folks in need who are affected by who or likely food insecure before, and this has just made things worse. So we started connecting with organizations. Right now we're working with 80 organizations across the city to provide access to free good food boxes to the folks that they work with. We deliver them right to their homes, and they're identical to the good food box that comes to your home, that comes to my home, that beautiful fresh produce. And then we realized that as all of what was happening, and in my community, there was Regis Paczynski, who was as a result of an interaction with the police, died, which is far too often the case. There was a lot of anger. I was very angry, and this was on the heels of everything happening in the US. A number of folks organized a group called Not Another Black Life, organized a march on the Saturday. I went. It was very powerful. I was a mixture of sad and energized. But
May I interrupt you? May I interrupt you and just ask you a little bit more about that?
Yeah.
In what way did you find it powerful, and what did you experience participating in it?
Yeah, just the coming together of predominantly Black folks with support of Indigenous folks and some allies, saying this is unacceptable and we want to see change, and we're going to continue to push for change, and recognizing that this moment we're not going back to what there was before. So I was really energized by the solidarity in the space. I was energized by people taking significant risk.
Right.
I'm personally, I'm an asthmatic and wrestled with whether or not I would go. And I thought, this is one public health crisis versus another public health crisis, So I thought, I'm going to show up and I'm going to be there in solidarity with folks that are pushing for something different. And yeah, I was really moved. And folks, through conversations with some of the organizers behind Not Another Black Life, we decided pretty early on that we were going to set up this initiative, and FoodShare kicked in $10,000 immediately. We didn't know if we were going to raise any money through this, but we said, you know what, it doesn't matter. This is really important. People have taken this type of risk. We know that Black folks are more at risk of food insecurity. We know that Indigenous folks are more at risk of food insecurity. So we're going to do what we can to support those folks who are working with us to challenge and push for real systemic change that gets at the root of anti-Black racism. So we've provided good food boxes. We've raised, about $125,000, I think, as of late. So now we're not only able to support all of the folks that went to the march and then are self-isolating, but we're also able to support an additional 10 Black serving organizations and providing excess funding equally to all of those groups so that they can purchase good food boxes and send them out to the folks that they work with. And I think that's one of the things, the type of data that we've come across has really helped FoodShare with. It really helps us recognize we can't just have these blanket interventions without recognizing the unique vulnerabilities that specific communities face, like Black and Indigenous folks. So our interventions must start with supporting those folks.
How was it received when you launched that initiative? I mean, I'm very interested in how leaders can create ideas for participation in community and supporting a community, and also raise $100,000 in change to support it in a very short window. That shows tremendous leadership and innovation. And I'm curious to know what fueled that innovation, and also like how it was received by the community.
Sure. I actually think it's very simple. When you have people in leadership positions in an organization that come from communities that experience high levels of food insecurity, when you have people in leadership positions who are Black and who have lived experience of poverty, and there are various folks on my team, on our board, that have lived experience of poverty, quite a few Black folks on our board, and it makes it an emergency. The statistics that we did with proof, wonderful and important, but maybe more important for helping to convince white folks. Black folks, we know this has been going on. Indigenous folks, they know this has been happening. So there's much quicker response. It's, let's cut all the nonsense that we need to go through. There's no application for the groups that we're working with. We didn't say, you need to fill out this application and tick all these boxes and tell us all this, da, 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 da. We said, you're working with vulnerable communities. We want to help you do that work. And I think that trust is important, and recognizing the urgency. And I think it's not the type of thing that people have seen, organizations the size of FoodShare respond in this way. There are some awesome organizations like Black Creek Community Farm that are doing great work, that are also doing similar emergency access to the Good Food Box initiatives for folks in the Jane Finch community, but also an organization led by a Black woman. So I think we see these types of interventions when folks are leading organizations that have that lived experience. And I think community sees the authenticity to the work. It's not about let's do this program because it's the next hot thing. Let's buy up all the food waste and come up with neat ways to redistribute it. It's about being authentic to the work and recognizing that we have an opportunity and an obligation to support communities most at risk. So we got to make that stuff happen quickly.
Can you tell me a bit more about Black Creek Community Farm? It sounds like a really cool thing, and I'd love to hear about it.
Sure, I'll try my best. I am in love with Black Creek Community Farm. I think they do such incredible work and is a real example of community leadership over a community food asset. These are folks in the Jane and Finch community who said, excuse me, this farm belongs to us, and we're going to use it as a mechanism to support our community. So, from all of the farming they do, all of the ways they engage community, providing affordable access to produce, providing programming, camp programming and the like for young people, I think is just young people, often Black folks, is so important, because so often, in my experience as a child, is I'm in, to access charity, we're in a lineup. I remember Christmas time, I'd be in a lineup with my mother. I would get a bag of gifts, boy 8. That's what the experience of charity looks like for the recipient. So again, I think folks like Letitia Diawo, who's the executive or the director of Black Creek Community Farm, recognizing that sucks. Mm-hmm. What's important is opportunities for communities to get involved in running, leading, building, dreaming about their organization. And I think it's an example. I encourage people to donate to Black Creek Community Farm as well.
We talked a bit earlier about how disruptive this time in the municipal evolution is, how every industry is going through a period of transformation. The municipal budget is going to have a lot of pressure on it. And we're rethinking so many things about the way we live, from how we use public space to where we work. If you could wave a magic wand and transform one thing about the way the city of Toronto works during this period of upheaval and transformation, what would that one thing be?
I think, before I even say this, I think there are so many people who have been saying this for many, many years before I've said this. Really want to acknowledge, folks like Sandy Hudson and Robin Maynard. These folks have been 2 Black women on the front lines pushing a conversation around defunding the police. The police are clearly not keeping Black folks safe, not keeping Indigenous folks safe. Like Regis, our interactions with the police often end with death or violence. So I think we need to actually think about, how do we reduce the police budget significantly? How do we defund the police? And actually direct those resources to community organizations like BCCF and groups across the city, and providing more holistic and thoughtful mental health supports, and the types of things that are actually proven to have more of an impact on people's lives. So that's one thing I would definitely advocate for.
Are you surprised to see what seemed quite recently like a radical notion being so speedily embraced by mainstream conversation?
Not really, because, the minute you see white folks willing to talk about issues that Black folks have been talking about for a long time, well, then, the ball starts moving quickly, motions start happening. Those motions could go a little further, but those motions start happening. And, so I wasn't surprised because I do think, part of the folks that are showing up across the country and in the US to say this is not okay, are really pushing a narrative and are not going to go away and are saying we want change. So I think it forced white folks to really look at themselves, look at the society that they've been largely the architects of, and really think about what types of things could be done to actually better serve Black folks, Indigenous folks, and other racialized people. So not surprised.
Do you see any other massive opportunities for change in this transformational moment in our history?
Definitely. And it goes back to that piece around, I feel like in a country as rich as this one, we shouldn't have 4 million people that are food insecure. We shouldn't have the housing crisis that we do. We shouldn't have homeless people. So I think as a country, we have got to say we can do much better. And we have to push back against, a federal government that's trying to convince us that tinkering is what we need. We actually need transformative change. And I think we need to be listening to, marginalized communities, vulnerable communities that have been saying things like this for a long time and take our cue from them.
So I'm going to ask you a final question, unless there's anything else you want to jump in and talk about. But I'm filled with admiration for your leadership during this time, and it does seem you've been able to innovate and pivot and advance many agenda items on your in your value set during this. At a time when really we're all feeling uncertain and there's tremendous anxiety. And, people are working from home. I'm curious to know, as a leader, if you have any advice for other people who are leading whatever organization or businesses, or, even as entrepreneurs, who might be in the audience, for how to be so creative and innovative during a time of such tribulation.
Oh, I appreciate the way you framed it, but I might say that, I think if businesses are not paying fair wages, if businesses are not providing benefits and paid sick leave and the types of things that workers need access to, those businesses are not sustainable. So I think for FoodShare, I work with an awesome senior leadership team, an awesome team altogether. But, I think these were conversations that we have every day, and we had them way before COVID-19. Yes, when we have our essential workers, our good food box packers and folks delivering produce, yes, we gave them a $4 raise, $4 an hour raise. But even way before that, we did things like applying a poverty reduction lens to our most recent pay grid review, which had us give folks at the bottom of the pay grid a 25% increase. Folks at the top of the pay grid, the senior leadership team, our senior managers, 0 increase. Everyone else got a bit of an increase. So really challenging the types of things and modeling the types of things we want to see in the world, and challenging income inequality. One of the things that we're also really proud of is that I think not enough organizations are stepping up to the plate to do, is we introduce a wage ratio. So the lowest waged worker to the highest waged worker. That ratio is 1 to 3.7. So the highest paid worker, the executive director, can make no more than 3.7 times what the lowest paid worker makes. We're all in this together. We're all doing this work together. So I think that's really important. And we know that racialized folks are often occupying low wage positions in the food system. So it's one of the ways that we are living our values of food justice. But I think if I can just add a couple other things, there are systems that we need to look at. FoodShare is not immune to white supremacy, but what we are committed to doing is trying our best to identify where white supremacy, anti-Black racism, where our thinking is colonial in nature, and how we can dismantle those within our processes. So, for example, our hiring practices. We have anonymized, the review committee looks at anonymized resumes. We de-emphasize paid accreditations from post-secondary universities and where else have you, because of course access to those things is largely based on privilege. When we post our jobs, we include what the pay range is. And also when we could post on Workopolis and Charity Village and we'll get the same types of people applying. But instead, sure, we do that. But we also have great relationships with a bunch of other organizations that are working with folks from equity-seeking groups, that when we have a job posting, we call them up and before we email it to them and say, hey, we're about to post this position, feel free to please share it with folks that you know, ask us any questions, that sort of thing. So it's really about thinking about a people-first agenda, because we ultimately are all in this together, and that has to be the frame for our work.
I'm going to ask you one last question. I know I promised you my last question was the last question. I apologize. But you mentioned, this question of paying fair wages. Obviously, in the sort of gig economy, Silicon Valley, app-based workspace, there was already a robust discussion around minimum wage and fair wages and the suppression of unions throughout those giant companies. All of a sudden, as a result of COVID, in part, we're suddenly noticing that our most important frontline workers are often our least paid, least well paid. And I'm wondering if you think this moment has the opportunity for transformational change, because we are more aware of how badly paid our grocery store shelvers are, and how little money the Uber Eats bicycle delivery person receives. I'm wondering if you're optimistic that this attention to this inequality question around wages will lead to some progress.
So I think two things. One, it's been I go on walks in the morning, every morning, and it's been pretty difficult when I see the bus go by, I see the streetcar go by, who I see in that bus from the moment the pandemic hit. They're often racialized women who are leaving their families, who are going to low-wage work, and often in places where physical distancing is difficult, often where they don't have access to PPEs. So I say that because I think the onus should not be on employers. It's great that FoodShare does some of the things we do, and don't get me wrong, we don't pay enough, and we're committed to continuing to work on that. But I think we need a policy framework. We can't rely on just like we can't rely on donations from billionaires, we can't rely on the benevolence of an employer. We need a policy framework that supports low-wage workers in our food system, because yes, they are essential. So I think that there is a potential there, but we need our governments to step up.
I want to thank you for spending so much time with us and for answering these questions and for giving us your insights and your experience. It's been really educational and valuable. So thank you so much for that. And thank you to all of our audience members for joining us. It was great to have you on this call, and we look forward at Toronto Life to hosting you for future The City Live events. Paul, good evening.
Thank you so much.